All right, we're all starting to come back. And there's Carla. Let's see, everybody, the rest of us will be back in a few seconds. All right. All right, I think we're all here. Carla, it's over to you.
All right, so we are going to do a report out. I hope everyone enjoyed the discussions in the breakout rooms. We'll do a report out now from each of the different rooms. We have about 30 minutes for this part of the summit. And so I'm just going to call the facilitators to present their report. And then we'll, if there's time, we can get into any further discussion. If people have questions, again, of the report out, go ahead and throw those questions in the chat room. So let's start with Karina and workforce development.
Hi, thanks Carla. Hi everyone, this is Karina with the Workforce Development Breakout Group. I'm processing these notes in real time here, but I'll share some of the highlights. It was a great and short conversation, but we started by discussing and asking folks to share about some of the most critical workforce development challenges that they're facing in their own regions, communities, or agencies. So some of the challenges that were shared were that it's hard to convince municipalities that there is a trained workforce and that there's a need for one, that there are jobs in this industry. So convincing decision makers that this is a worthwhile endeavor. We had a couple folks touch on retraining challenges, not both from a logistical perspective that just the actual logistics of managing a crew can be very chaotic, and there's a lot of trial and error to getting that right and getting the right capacity for that. But also that there's real challenges in some of these retraining programs with participant turnover. I mean, people have motivations that are sometimes just more immediate than community environment. They need to work, and sometimes there's a lot of turnover in those groups. But it really takes a good, strong crew that has gelled to really make this work, and for that to happen, folks need to stick around. So incentivizing folks to do that and maintaining some consistency in personnel is important. Just generally finding the right people to run training programs, and not only to sustain the training programs in the long term, but then making sure that there are actually jobs for folks who come out of these programs, just sort of ensuring their success, the success of the program and the success of the folks coming out of it. Consistent funding to pay people properly. There was one interesting challenge noted that when a utility requires, let me see if I get this right, requires but does not inspect a project. So that I think that what's meant by that is it's a requirement, but then there's no follow-up or required follow-up on that, and that feels like a gap, and it doesn't incentivize a real market. So, and in some cases they won't fund maintenance at all. So that's a challenge to actually incentivize the work happening. And finally, that there are certification programs out there that are not, where there's questions about whether they're being fully embraced by employers. They're great programs like the NGICP, and they really help folks learn a lot, but do they mean what do they really mean for folks who are employing? Is that a real incentive for them that someone would have a certification? Sorry, we spent probably the longest time talking about challenges, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of great ideas about how to solve. Okay, can you still hear me?
I lost the tail end of that last comment you made.
Okay, I was just saying, I was just talking about the last challenge there, which is whether certifications are fully embraced by employers or not. And there's questions about how much those certifications mean. And then we got a chance to flip over quickly to what are some of the tools or resources that would help solve these workforce development challenges. So one of the things brought up was requiring that someone on a bid has a certification, like an NGICP certification is huge, and that bolsters the certification programs, but also increases the likelihood of knowledge on a project, right? And then there folks talked about programs like the Conservation Corps programs. In this case, it was Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa that do a lot of natural space work, including green infrastructure. And we had a little discussion, there's a hope that these programs go on to lead, to help people have jobs and careers in this field. And there were some questions as to whether that's actually the case. And we had a little bit of discussion about that. And largely, it seems like there's a lot of people that they do, and that there's a lot of transferable skills that come out of this too. So these types of programs. And then we talked just briefly about some of the players that need to be involved in the tools and resources ideas here. And one of the examples brought forward was the Natural Resource Environment Trust Fund in Minnesota, and whether there are like programs in other states. We didn't really get there. We talked a lot about community colleges, how they're already promoting some of these training programs, and maybe there's more opportunities there for those to help bridge gaps between entry-level folks and higher ed folks who are maybe re-entering the workforce, just kind of capturing that particular audience. Workforce development agencies, nonprofits, and we talked about a really interesting model of restoration grants can be a really interesting model that people are using when they're writing in, and not just going after workforce dollars, right? They're writing in folks like Conservation Corps crews into their public land restoration projects, so that it effectively becomes pass-through money for these folks to help implement these projects. And that's a model that there were heads nodding in the group. That's been a successful way of approaching projects and getting the money to go towards supporting folks in work without having to go after workforce dollars. That was a lot of, I just wanted to capture most of what the group said. We could have talked a lot longer, but I will be sharing my notes with the group, and thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Yeah, 30 minutes, it sounds like a lot of time, but it really isn't. Thank you for that. Let's now go to Steve, your group, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What were some of your findings?
So our group, really there was a theme that was emerging throughout the 30 minutes of discussions. We talked about some of the most critical workforce challenges, ways to solve those challenges, and who should be involved. And that theme's, a lot of it centered around overcoming institutional racism. And so, for example, in the question, what are some of the most critical workforce challenges when it comes to DEI? Several folks said that there was distrust in some of their communities because the city government is associated with departments like the police department. And so there was just that hurdle to get over. And along that line, sort of this idea that people may hear that green jobs are not welcoming for people of color. So a lot of the discussion in the second part, which was dealing with how to address these issues, looking at engaging the stakeholders and community early on in the decision-making process to help gain trust, to help make sure that you're addressing the needs. Other things along the lines of addressing these issues were making sure you can pay people a living wage, and along the lines of doing that, making sure that you can pull your resources together to do that. One statement was, basically this kind of summarizes a lot of it, allowing community partners and organizations to be involved at all levels so they can break down systems of power to allow true community voice and power. And also looking beyond just the physical labor in terms of workforce development. There's other parts of work that goes into green infrastructure besides just physical labor. There's the design of these systems, and so making sure that we're looking at the bigger picture in terms of DEI and the job opportunities that are available there. And also making sure that there's a face out there so that even young people can see opportunities that are available in green infrastructure throughout their development, throughout their lives. In terms of who needs to be involved, we've kind of been talking about that along the way, making sure that there's relationships between the stakeholders and decision makers, getting buy-in from HR, Public Works. They have to be part of this whole process. They have to be believers in the process. And making sure that just, again, there's a long-term partnership with the community so that there's a two-way flow of ideas and identifying needs. And having a group available to facilitate this. And finally, for the funding sources, one person suggested that there really needs to be a way to communicate the value of maintaining these resources that are in place to the community so that they see the value of this. And apparently going outside of the Clean Water Fund, there's really less money available there for DEI work, so looking for sources outside of the Clean Water Fund. So that's in a nutshell what we were talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Okay, we're now going to hear from the community practice planning and policy groups. So let's start first with Kathy. Do you want to go ahead and share what your group discussed?
Thank you very much. So I have, in our Google Docs, I've highlighted just a few things that I wanted to share. When we talk about the opportunity of integrating this community planning policy and practice around workforce challenges, I think one of the key things that our group came away with was just being aware of how these issues intersect and how they can be integrated is where we're going to discover the opportunities. Some of the participants talked about how understanding funding and language really helped to open up the opportunities for that integration of concepts, as well as finding the various funding streams. So we're talking traditionally about water quality and flooding, but should we also be talking about the value of the impacts on public health, the multiple applications of that green infrastructure in our communities? A lot of the focus on the training and the jobs opportunities is in horticulture, but can we really look at it from a career pathways standpoint, which was noted by some of the communities that came forth. For us in Extension world, our training in the past may not have included this green infrastructure concept and practice. And so how do we begin to infuse this green infrastructure planning into our work with master naturalists and master gardeners? So I think there's a real opportunity if we're able to give people full ways to participate, giving them the power, the knowledge, and the opportunity to inform the work that gets done in communities. Perhaps our greatest challenge in the workforce development arena is how do we trigger the interest of early career professionals in that engaging youth, young professionals, helping them to see the opportunities in trade and versus a 4-year degree perhaps. And so we really need to think about how do we expose young people to the opportunities that may be there. And I think it's especially challenging, we had a wide variety of backgrounds in our group. And my assumption is that we have a wide variety of backgrounds participating in this conversation today. And the issue of workforce development is, you know, it's a tough one because your subject matter background is probably in a certain scientific field. And, you know, that whole notion of workforce development is a different process and skill set that you're trying to cultivate in your community. So, you know, again, the opportunity to capitalize on that is going to happen by engaging multiple partners, that it's not something that an individual or a group can do on their own, because it's a challenge. Workforce development is a challenging piece in and of itself, and you have the technical or the scientific skills, but maybe not that human capacity building piece. I just highlighted just a couple more things and then I'm going to stop. We have some great notes, and our team worked to edit those as I was talking. But I think the players that need to be involved, and the point that was brought forward, I thought was an excellent one, that everybody to a certain degree, and really thinking about, even though our concern may be in specific geographies or neighborhoods in our community because of the infrastructure that's there, we really need the entire community engaged in that conversation, not just a neighborhood. You know, I think that's where the real opportunity to move forward as a community lie is, when we come together and not continue to segment. And I think we all recognize that engaging the community in meaningful ways takes a lot of time. And it's a huge investment of resources. But if we don't go to the source, we oftentimes really miss important parts of the solution. And so, you know, really making that upfront investment and kind of broadening the scope really helps to point to new solutions, new opportunities, and it speaks to this whole issue of funding and workforce. If we can broaden the base, we're going to have greater opportunities to enhance not only the community, but multiple aspects of that community, like communication, public health, community change. All of those things can be impacted when we engage these non-traditional sources in meaningful ways.
It's interesting. Thank you so much for that. As you were talking, it's really interesting to see, when we're talking from the other two report outs so far, this kind of theme around making sure that we are investing in the development of young people to come into this space. It's nice to kind of see some of these things develop across the different subject areas that we are talking about. Okay, let's go now to the second community practice planning and policy conversation. So Megan, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and if you can give us a report out on what your group talked about.
Yes, happy to do that, Carla. And I also just wanted to update the rest of the team that I believe our questions were the same questions as the workforce development. So our conversations will be focused more on that. So just as a heads up for that. So from the conversation that we had about most critical workforce challenges, there were a lot of different discussions around the need for more training, especially training for maintenance, and then also recruiting effective contractors and developers, and then recruiting other just like program participants in the future. So that was something that was discussed, and we also kind of had a discussion about how it's difficult to rank which one is the most pressing need or the biggest challenge, because many of them are things that you need to develop in hand with one another. And then there's also the need, and this ties into the potential tools and resources to help address some of these workforce challenges, is just the need to recognize the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program and really highlight that as a way to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of like green infrastructure implementation, and we understand what are the best practices moving forward. So we have that content knowledge. In terms of recruiting of effective contractors and developers, there was an interesting discussion around scaling of projects. So with the example that Jojo shared, some of the communities, it was easier. There's a limited number of smaller contractors that were able to do green infrastructure work. And as you scaled up the projects to make it biddable for these larger contractors, it really increased the cost of the project beyond what the project should have costed. So thinking about that and trying to have a different level of contractor development that will be able to address some of these different types of projects is needed. And then just, again, the need for more training for variety of different workers, including like the long-term public works staff for implementing these projects after they're installed. There were a number of different tools and resources that were highlighted, including, as I mentioned earlier, the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. As highlighted during the earlier presentations, we discussed the need for more case studies to really highlight best practices and ways to develop and address some of these workforce challenges. And then a variety of different examples were shared, from the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program to the Green Streets case studies. And then also it was highlighted the role of asset management planning for supporting green infrastructure, and how with life cycle cost analysis, how this can be really helpful for making decisions, especially when it comes to looking at budgets. And this is something that could it was referenced for how this is mandated in Ontario, but this might be something that's mandated across other communities in the United States. But they highlighted a resource from the Federation for Canadian Municipalities. And then in terms of local players to really support workforce development, they highlighted local Sea Grant and NERS partners for supporting trainings, and then also the need to have public works directors involved in those trainings to make sure that they're able to speak of all the different benefits of these types of development, so they're really on board for the planning. And it really just came down to, like, you need to have everyone on board for really to move this project and plan forward. And then in terms of funding sources, we weren't able to have a large discussion around this, but it was mentioned that that local transportation planning does have funds that can allocate some of the federal transportation dollars to support green infrastructure projects, and how some communities are sharing that. And I see that some of our group members also shared information in the chat. So thank you for doing that.
Great. Yeah, I was going to also bring some of those comments to the discussion. But first, thank you so much for that report out. Let's now hear from our last group. Kara, let's hear from you about the conversation and discussion that went on in the network planning room.
Great, thanks so much. We had great conversation. Of course, it went quickly. I did do a tally of people who attended. So we did have 3 organizations, 5 university cooperative extension service programs, and 4 Sea Grant college programs represented. So a lot of the people who attended were those who are providing education and training to others too. And so we had 3 overarching questions that we were tasked to, and we got to 2 of them. And the first one is, what are the tools and trainings we need to do our jobs better? So we spent the most time around this one. And there's some fairly specific things, but then we also have some general themes that came out too. So there's a project looking for creating resources of lists of green infrastructure salt tolerance plans from peer-reviewed science resources. There aren't a lot available. That's something that University of Illinois Extension is working on too. There's interest in having resources available such as statewide compilation or inventory of green infrastructure projects. We know that there are challenges with this because context locations shift, but there are some regional efforts, and looking at the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative, and we've looked at, there's a reference to the past efforts that still linked of the nationwide map of low impact development from University of Connecticut. So looking at resurrecting some of those types of projects to help us with peer learning and examples. We did spend a lot of time talking about training to cost out green infrastructure projects, including long-term projects, that there's a need to help compare the cost of green to gray infrastructure at the planning level for general estimates. There's also a need to have these types of discussion points and summaries, references of green and gray infrastructure as we're providing and facilitating these conversations and trainings, as well as the associated savings. It's confusing to wade through some of these resources, so we need something with cost that can be compiled and easily utilized. And again, there are some challenges because projects are site specific, but this opens opportunities for case studies and sharing those practices too of different examples. Another major theme is green infrastructure training, information sharing kind of 101 for elected officials, municipal staff, and lay audiences at a community focus. We're interested in having compilations again from best practices from others. Sharing and exchanging information is something that's a major theme here. We also recognize that it's hard to get elected officials in a training because they have other jobs. They many times are sending other staff. So we want to keep talking about different ways we engage with them. And so are you attending council meetings? Are you communicating in different ways? What are some of those best practices? And we'd like to see, let me see here. Highlighted information. This is a really great point. In addition to the Green Infrastructure 101, we also need kind of that Green Infrastructure 201, that it introduces green infrastructure to communities and examples of practices, but also to highlight that this isn't necessarily as novel anymore as some conversations keep saying that it is. That yes, a lot of people are just getting started, while others are pretty well informed. And so we need to help highlight and make those connections with peer learning and show that, yeah, other people have done it, you could do it too, yay. And highlighting both communities and businesses. And we had some mention of connecting with Association of Landscape Architecture architects for some resources as well. And that also highlighting the examples of the bad or failed green infrastructure projects that we need to learn from these lessons, build from the failures to make them into positives, turn the frown upside down, as we talked about. And that one of the interesting things that New Hampshire research is highlighting is thinking about design and flipping it on its head so that you're designing more for that long-term maintenance, who's owning it, how they're going to be working within the space, for example, with what equipment they have and how to manage this long-term. So we need to get more of that type of information out. We did spend just a little bit of time on how our network could be structured. We had such great discussion going and what we need and some good ideas, but we had a few bullets here. So we could create a listserv just very simply to share information, to get people out back and forth info. There was an interest in having an additional needs assessment to ask these more questions in depth to determine some next steps and really digging into projects. Webinar series came up, but more of as an ad needed type of aspect to highlight projects and lessons as a resource. And one of the biggest themes that I'll reiterate here is forums for information sharing. This came up a lot, that people want to get together to talk about what they're doing. We're all working in these different spaces and places, but we may not have our peers right next to us. So having this type of opportunity to get together about what worked, what didn't, what are trends, how we can connect, that there's a lot of value in that kind of network and getting together. And then someone else also brought up that intentionally collaborating and connecting with community development professionals is important so that we can co-learn there as well. And yay, Steve, right? And then to make the connections between community development, green space, and green infrastructure efforts. Another suggestion is that we could also have, some Google Docs and things to share. We didn't get into the funding resources discussion part of this, and that's where we left it. Really great information.
Great. Yes, absolutely. And you covered quite a lot. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for participating. I have a couple of things that have come up, some comments in the chat, and I'm going to call on some folks because it might be helpful to just kind of hear a little bit more about your thinking in some of these things. So Margaret, you had mentioned in the chat, when you're focusing on implementing projects in a particular neighborhood, you can involve the entire community, and that can be confusing for people not in that area. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Just give us some a little bit more background about what you mean there.
Yeah, so I was thinking of a specific project where we were implementing GI at the community scale, but because of funding, we had to start with a particular neighborhood. And so we did try to engage the entire community, but we had people get frustrated because they didn't really understand. We tried to explain why we were starting with that particular neighborhood, that we had done an assessment, we had done previous community outreach to determine that that's where we would start. But it just felt like there was more kind of frustration with what those community members' role was once we were at that neighborhood scale of implementation, and kind of feeling like they were disengaged or isolated, or had been kind of like otherwise not included in the process. So they had trouble really engaging with that, even though we had like design level renderings. We thought we did everything right. We had design level renderings saying, well, this is what it would look like on your street. We just don't have enough funding for everything. But that, again, ended up being kind of frustrating for some folks in the community.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Andrea Kraus, you have a really interesting example of community education and involvement in the chat. You mentioned here that your group does green infrastructure tours of the community, and people are always impressed because they didn't know so much was happening in the community and are quite inspired. I love this idea. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about how you all came up with that idea and how that gets executed.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share any of the materials we put together for it too, but it did start with my predecessor in this job, who was overseeing some implementation of green infrastructure on private properties. Our office at the City of Superior handles stormwater permitting, and we do offer a credit program to people who install green infrastructure practices to a certain degree of attenuation of TSS and flow. And so we highlight some of those private properties, but also look at city BMPs, water quality basins, a constructed wetland, pervious pavers, things like that. And so we rent a school bus, and we focus on the whole population on our invite list, but we make a special request, a personal request to all our local elected officials at the county and city council so that they can come around and see how this is protecting water resources. We're right on Lake Superior, and we're also in an area of concern, St. Louis River area of concern. And so we can really focus on the benefit this provides, both in terms of preserving recreation and tourism for the area, but also saving the city money by reducing stormwater flows. And we have combined districts as well. And I saw somebody commenting that, yeah, this can be frustrating. It can be seen as wasting money on kind of frivolous, pretty things, but that's where looking at the financial benefit of it can be really helpful, and what grants were used to help fund these projects is always highlighted. So yeah, I'd be happy to share a PDF of our tour route. So each stop has its own little page with what was done, how it works, what they might not be able to see because it's underground or so forth.
Great. I'm just curious, how many tours do you guys think you do a year?
We do one year. We end up doing 2 each summer. We try to pick like a midday during the week for people who plan it into their work time. And then we'll often do a weekend tour as well. The same route, 2 different times. And, you know, we'll see what we do this year, how we handle it. We have talked about just highlighting 1 BMP at a time instead of doing a multiple-hour bus tour, just saying, here's our location, meet us at this location at this time, and we'll talk about what's happening there. And then people could just show up for half an hour and leave and meet us the next week somewhere else.
I love that idea. It gets at a lot of some of these challenges, right, in terms of broad-based education, but also demonstrating the value of these projects and programs to partners. And I want to say a little bit about elected officials. I don't know if we have any elected officials on the call here. I worked with 3 mayoral administrations in Cincinnati. Worked with mayors around the country, and I love the first response, if you will, challenge that mayors and cities have on these issues. And so, Kara, I think your group was talking about, you know, how difficult it is to kind of engage mayors or electeds on these issues. And I would suggest that the group kind of consider partnering with or having this conversation with groups like National League of Cities, which I think was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, I want to say from Gary, or with groups like the US Conference of Mayors. And especially now as we begin to kind of discuss what operations look like at the municipal level under a pandemic and kind of recovering and bringing ourselves out of this, there are opportunities to do this, create a new normal that really addresses green and sustainable projects as a way out of this situation. And mayors and elected officials at the local level, county officials, they will be helping to drive this. And I think you're absolutely correct. They need to have a certain level of understanding and understanding not only how these projects and programs are put together, but you know, the benefits of those programs. And so these organizations like NLC and US Conference of Mayors, they can form committees at their organizational levels and start bringing in people, bringing in electeds to for that kind of like series of educational workshops. So that might be something to also tap into. I think we have, let me just double check here. To see if there's anything else here. We have Jason Frenzel, who is on the call. He used to be on City Council. Jason, if you wouldn't mind offering any thoughts also about how to get elected officials more engaged in this conversation.
Elected officials are as unique as the communities they serve, of course. And I think a lot of the things that all the presenters brought up hit the mark really well. If we prove ourselves to be valuable to the community, sort of like inserting ourselves into their domain, we become very important, especially if we bring those community resources, solutions to bear. And has been brought up multiple times when we bring solutions to localized problems and when we bring money to the table. All of those things are, you know, interesting to our community leaders. I would say that the politics of every community is unique, and I can't comment on that at all.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That we are at a little bit of time. Actually, we've got about 4 more minutes left in this session. I'm just curious if there are any other questions of what was presented in our sessions. Some great information there.
And Carla, this is Lisa. I won't take the full half an hour for our close and wrap up. So if we want to go, if there's conversation, let's have it. And I'll just need maybe 10 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple more messages. I'm gonna. So let's see, Karina mentions in the comments that there is a common thread that she heard across report outs was that we can do more to establish the value of green infrastructure certification programs like NGICP. Yes, I agree, and I heard that as well. I'd be interested in hearing some more thoughts on what can we do to enhance the value or the perceived value of certification programs like that. If anyone wants to jump in there, that would be ideal. Margot, you mentioned here about the cost of NG ICP, and are there scholarships available for people? That's a really good comment. I'd be interested in hearing if that is the case. If we're going to be highlighting those certification programs, and I think there was a suggestion in one of the report outs to require that certification, right, on some of these projects, which I think is a great idea, but I think also the access to those programs might also need to be addressed. So does anyone have any thoughts on scholarship opportunities for those certification programs?
Hey, Carla, this is Wendy Ogilvie in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think I was the one that mentioned the requirement of the city. They require any bid that is done on a city project to have someone on the team that has an NGICP certification. Mm-hmm. The cost of the whole program is incredible. It's really, really expensive. Oh. And we're fortunate that we got a grant through, it's called Michigan's Regional Prosperity Initiative. So the initial funding to purchase the program was through that. And then it was a grant to the Grand Rapids Community College. So we've been working with them to facilitate the program, and through the college, they're often able to get Pell Grants or different grants to allow the students to be able to take the course. And, you know, even the exam is like $200 to take the course. So, you know, they cover that cost as well. So it is really expensive. And I think that's going to be a big issue in moving it forward when we don't necessarily have the grants, or, you know, just removing those barriers for people to be able to take the exam.
Okay, great. Yeah, that would be helpful, especially if there are these programs, and I don't know how this would work, but as I heard in some of the presentations, there are programs for folks in high school and maybe early college, and then there are individual programs that kind of get you into kind of training programs, early career training programs. And it seems like there's this stair step that these individuals can take that help us kind of address this idea of not just jobs, but careers. but it would be really disappointing if an individual kind of went through all of those programs, but was not able to access that certification, that certificate, or get into the certification program because of that funding barrier. So yeah, that's interesting. Lisa Harris, you mentioned you've received financial support to take the NGICP from Urban Waters Partnership in Northwest Indiana with an offer to provide assistance. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? How did that work out for you? If you could share.
Yeah, it was great. It was great to get support from them because I attend meetings and participate as I can. And they actually had, I think, at least 2 scholarships to help pay for attendance. And it was, since I'm starting up my own business, it was a bit cost prohibitive for me by myself. But it was just a great opportunity because sitting in the Urban Waters meetings, there's so many connections to be made, and you hear so many stories and so many resources. So it was just a great opportunity to be able to take advantage of that. They're very generous.
Curious to know, how do you find these opportunities, the scholarship opportunities? Is there also, I think someone mentioned, would be great to have the listserv of kind of GI programs and things of that nature, but in terms of scholarships and what have you for this kind of work, how do you find those opportunities?
For this one, the Urban Waters has a monthly email that they send out, and they provide all kinds of resources for grant opportunities from various sources. And I think I actually heard about this this event on their email. So it's like a clearinghouse for you know, water issues, and green infrastructures is a very big topic for them. There's a lot of urban forestry projects that are happening in Gary and other places. So if there are other collaborative groups and entities like that, whether they provide something or not, you could always ask. You know, they may have funding. It's amazing. It's amazing what you can get when you ask for it.
Right.
People actually have resources that you can take advantage of.
One of my best friends has this saying, if you don't ASK, you won't GET, which makes sense, right? But thank you for that. It's great to hear that those kinds of opportunities are out there. Laura Brown, you have comments, a couple of thoughts in the chat. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of these. You mentioned the continuous need for tools and strategies for equitable community engagement practice seems to be integral to success. And then workforce development career pathways, conversations require organizational engagement with those who are most skilled in the workforce development. I wonder if you could elaborate and talk a little bit about your experiences there.
I was just reflecting on our small group discussion and the themes that I heard today. I think the opportunity for work in this field around the equity piece really requires a specific skill set. Many of us are active in the community development arena, but to intentionally engage in a way that you're promoting equity within your community is a different set of techniques, I think, and many of us haven't been trained on those either, right? And so to do this work well, that appears to be a necessary part that needs to be brought into the work. And then my second thought was just a reflection of the conversation around, you know, many of the folks that are engaged in this work have the technical scientific background of, you know, what the green plant materials are you know, from an engineering perspective, the technical side of it, but we've never been placed in that position of being responsible for helping an individual create their career pathway. And that's a different group in our community that knows that field well. So sometimes it's economic development organizations, sometimes it's happening at your community college or high school, but they know the ingredients of a program that really work with that individual to help them build their full human potential. And to intentionally, I think the other comment that kind of came up in our discussion is, you know, you can put them in a job, you know, but is that job a pathway? You know, is it going to lead to continuous growth and as an individual and create a sustainable living wage for that family?
I see. Yeah. You know, that kind of reminds me of some of the conversation and some of the comments that folks were making, not just in the report outs, but also throughout the presentations, that one, as you so well put, you know, there are specific skill sets that are needed for addressing some of these newer elements of what we're talking about for this work, if we're going to be successful at being equitable and sustainable with this. And in some of the presentations, you know, there were conversations about the need to have a very, very large team, right? To bring so many people to the table with these projects, right? Because you're not really, you know, when you don't really think about a project or a program that you're working on, that now you need to really think about, you know, connecting with housing or connecting with social services or connecting with the community college to ensure that, you know, the workforce development piece is part of their career development pathway. So I'm just curious if others have thoughts on when you are building out the team or the advisory group for these programs, what kind of skill sets does the leadership of that group need, based off of the conversations that we've had in today's discussions? Do people have examples of building those larger, more broad leadership organizations or leadership teams so that those projects can be more successful when it comes to doing an equitable project like what we're talking about? Any examples of working with a cross-discipline team to get projects like this done successfully? Okay. Lisa Harris, you mentioned mentoring is key. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I've actually recently found that joining the consulting arena is it has been challenging. Unfortunately, I have found some people who are able to kind of guide me through, but it's not something for me. I have a science background and culinary background, and haven't really had that business aspect kind of ingrained in my work style and stuff. So it's been very interesting trying to figure out how to break into that area. But now that I have a couple people who've taken me under their wing, it's like, oh, okay, I can do this. You know, I can actually figure out how to communicate and what the jargon is and what all the different, I don't know, ways of entering those fields, and how to frame myself so that I am taken seriously for the types of things that I want to do. And it's a great necessity for me. I mean, it's taken me a long time to actually figure out how to move forward with this.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Lisa, we don't have any more. I think I've gotten all of the comments out of the chat, the group chat session here. So I think we may be at the tail end, unless there are any other comments or questions or experiences that folks would like to share that they may not have heard mentioned in some of these report outs or the conversation and discussion we've just had. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for sticking it out until the very end. Thank you, Carla, for leading us through that discussion. That was fabulous. I have a couple notes. First of all, thank you so much for everybody for contributing, for being here, for having this conversation with us. I was blown away by the response. This started as an idea with a couple of us, and it's really heartening to see that so many of us are interested in using natural resource solutions to have a broader impact. I want to make sure to thank the people who facilitated the breakout sessions. That was a fair amount of work, and I really appreciate you doing it. I want to thank the North Central Region Water Network for funding us. That's key. That's how this all happens, and for getting us started. Carla Walker, thank you so much for all you did to pull everything together, and all of you who were on the planning committee to help us design this agenda and put it together. Thank you so much. A note to participants: most of you registered. Some of you emailed me after the registration closed. If you got this through somebody else, basically we threw the net wide, but if I don't know who you are, I can't continue to include you in the conversation so that you can participate as you want to. So just send me a note, or you can find me through University of Illinois Extension. I'm in the Community and Economic Development section. So send me a note, make sure I know who you are, if I would not have other reason to know who you are. In terms of next steps, in the next few days, we will get out slides for presentations. We will get out links or things that people mentioned that some of you had asked for. We'll send that kind of stuff. We did record this. That may take us a little bit more time to kind of edit out the blank spaces, but we'll try and share all that with everyone as well. We will be compiling and writing, so we'll be compiling kind of our process on the listening sessions and some of those lessons learned that Tony shared earlier. We'll be compiling the discussions and what came out of our polls and out of our breakouts for this session, and we will try to kind of prioritize. We may come back to you for some more questions to help us narrow down and continue to prioritize. We'll have to, the core group will get together and we'll kind of decide what our process is on that. But our goal is to have a white paper out to all of you, to the world, by the end of July. So that's our plan. So look for it in about that time frame. Do I have anything else? I think that's all I have. Any other comments or questions or concerns or things we should think about before we adjourn?
Just a big thank you to you, Lisa.
Oh, thanks.
You and Tony for such an incredible job pulling this together, and this is great work. This is great work.
Well, you know, it's a lot of work going in, but it's always so great when it all comes together, and we get like minds in the same space at the same time, even though we're not in the same room.
Yeah.
I think we might have even had a more successful day. So thank you so much.
Well, this is Rebecca Power, North Central Region Water Network. Yes, thanks to Lisa and to Carla and to the whole planning team for making this idea a reality. And it started out with a very small group, as you know, and a deeply committed group. And so glad to all of you who participated that are our tribe on this issue across the region. So, you know, it as we've talked about the whole time, it takes so many of us with many different sectors and perspectives to do this. So really appreciate everybody's participation.
All right. With that, we will end the day. Thank you for sticking with me, and you will hear from us soon. Thanks. Bye.